All right, are you sorry you asked for Plato? Because we're still going. Episode 8. Plato as a utopian communist? Question mark. Welcome to Godward Podcast. I'm your host, Casey. Check me out on Twitter at Godward16 and elsewhere. This is going to be a quick one. My wife just took the kids to the Walmart for something, and so, I don't know, I may not even go the whole 45 here. I think Book 8 of the Republic, if you've understood Books 2 and 6 and 7, it's pretty easy, actually. But I know that, my listeners, my constituents are the lazy ones who don't do the reading, so they want me to report what it says to them. So you're going to get a little of that today. In my view, what Socrates gives us here is not unlike what Augustine would compose 6 or 7 centuries later in his work City of God. Listen to the first few paragraphs of Book 8 and judge for yourself whether Socrates is saying this is how things should be arranged, or is this some sort of literary irony where he's trying to demonstrate the limits of political planning. Quote, "All right, this much has been agreed, Glaucon. For a city that is going to be governed on a high level, women must be in common. Children and their entire education must be in common. And similarly, the practices in war and peace must be in common, and their kings must be those among them who have proved best in philosophy and with respect to war. Furthermore, we also accepted that when the rulers are once established, they must take the lead and settle the soldiers in houses, such as we spoke of before, that have nothing private for anyone, but are common for all. And in addition to such houses, as to possessions, if you remember, we presumably came to an agreement about what sort they are to have." Glaucon says, "Yes, I do remember, that we suppose that no one must possess any of the things the others nowadays have, but that like champions of war and guardians, they will receive a wage annually from the others, consisting of the bare subsistence required for their guarding. And for this wage they must take care of themselves and the rest of the city." And Socrates, I don't know, it could be, you guys, it could be that Socrates is some sort of naive utopian. I just don't think so. He does say later in, I think, Book 9, in fact, listen, I think I have a clip from Pierre Grimes on this one.
Plato's Republic is one of the great classics in the Western canon. I think it would be included in everybody's list of the world's great literary works. And I think most people assume, as I did, that Plato's Republic is primarily a book about a kind of utopian political system. You have a different perspective on it.
Yes.
This guy's 92.
In Book 2 of Plato's Republic, he spends a good part of Book 2 exploring the idea of justice and injustice. And he says, it is so difficult to understand justice and injustice because it's small, it's in man, and what we need is a larger model. He said, let's make an analogy with the state so that we can see justice and injustice in the state for its analogy to the soul. So the entire book of the Republic is an analogy. The soul is to justice as the state is to justice. And therefore, it's really a deep philosophical work, and it's only secondarily a political work. As a matter of fact, at the end of Book 9, Socrates is being asked by Glaucon. Glaucon says to Socrates, "Do you think this will ever come about?" And Socrates says, "No, it never come about. Not."
So yeah, in Book 9, he says specifically, this isn't a utopian schema, not really. It's just for thought, right? Man, I love, just sidebar, I love it when I hear somebody say something that it's like, oh, of course, it's like, yes, that is exactly what I think. Like, here's this 92-year-old guy, he's spent his whole life learning all this shit, and then I hear him do his little talk on Book 8 of the Republic, and it's like, yes, I agree. I guess to me that seems like that's the fruit of putting in the time to study a lot, because then what happens is eventually, finally, it's what we called the hymn of the dialectic in the last episode. It does start to come together, and only then do you start to fill out your own I was going to say Weltanschauung, worldview, like your own kind of personal zeitgeist starts to form. And then you don't have to, I guess you don't have to doubt your own interpretation as much. You're not as stuck. The same thing goes for me with like the mystics. It wasn't until I sort of became the mystic myself, see the sun first, as we said in the last episode, and then try to describe it, then do the analysis of it, and then you can read the others who've reported their own mystical experiences, and lo and behold, they're very similar to your own, okay? All right. In Book VIII, we are going to discuss the 4 regimes that we might call these like hegemonies or political orders or whatever. The 4 regimes that Socrates considers worthy of description. These all make a characteristic mistake, a mistake particular or peculiar to their own form, and that causes them to collapse or give way to the subsequent regime. Think of a regime as I said, a hegemony, and so there are 4 of these that deserve mention, as Socrates says, or 5 if you count the Utopian one that he's sort of been describing in the Republic, which would be the aristocracy, if it existed. Okay, so each of these hegemonies or, world orders, each of these corresponds to a form of human character. And this was what Pierre Grimes was trying to identify. Okay, again, like I've said this in the last couple episodes, yes, this sounds like it's about politics, but in reality, it's as much about human psychology and emotion and, character as it is about politics, probably more so. Listen to this little clip from Hesiod's Works and Days, which describes the descent from like a golden, essentially godlike race that was created by, Zeus and the Olympians, and these 5 generations, okay, that are each degenerating. The Greeks believed that, 5 generations ago, there were great heroes, but now we are their lowly descendants. And here's Hesiod on the 5th generation.
Far-seeing Zeus made yet another generation, the 5th, of men, who are upon the bounteous earth. Thereafter, would that I were not among the men of the 5th generation, but either had died before or been born afterwards. For now truly is a race of iron, and men never rest from labor and sorrow by day, and from perishing by night. And the gods shall lay sore trouble upon them. But, notwithstanding, even these shall have some good mingled with their evils, and Zeus will destroy this race of mortal men also, when they come to have grey hair on the temples at their birth. The father will not agree with his children, nor the children with their father, nor guest with his host, nor comrade with comrade, nor will brother be dear to brother as aforetime. Men will dishonor their parents as they grow quickly old, and will carp at them, chiding them with bitter words. Hard-hearted they, not knowing the fear of the gods. They will not repay their aged parents the cost of their nurture, for might shall be their right.
Okay, so that's like obviously not so great, right? That's the, I think he calls it the iron generation. That's like after, gold and silver and bronze and whatever the 4th one is, and then iron. And these people are basically just broken and have no sense of values or virtues. So the 4 regimes, which again correspond to personality types, are the Timocracy, which I'll describe in a moment. That's the one people are usually least familiar with. And then sort of degenerating from that, the oligarchy, that's the 2nd one. And degenerating from that, the democracy, the 3rd one. And always democracy gives way to the 4th one, which is tyranny. Okay? All right, so... And as I said, and don't forget the Utopian one, which is like the 5th, that exists sort of theoretically when kings are philosophers. That is the aristocracy. And it corresponds to the man who is both good and just. So let's go through these with Socrates. And I'd love to hear feedback, I guess on YouTube or something, if any of you think any of these descriptions corresponds to any existing state, really anywhere in history. Or like we could talk about, how America has changed from potentially, I don't know, like a timocracy maybe to an oligarchy to a democracy or whatever. So for instance, let's talk about this first regime after the aristocracy falls, which Socrates calls Timocracy or Timarchy. He says, this is the regime that loves victory and honor, And he cites the Laconian regime as an example. I don't know much about that, but the state that comes to my mind, and maybe I'm wrong or idealizing or whatever, but the one that comes to my mind is Japan before the Meiji Restoration in, I think that was 1868. So the old, samurai-based, honor-oriented Japanese traditional society, where men would, duel to the death or commit seppuku if someone insulted their honor somehow, okay? So Socrates begins describing this by saying, let's try to tell the way in which a Timocracy would arise from an aristocracy. And I'm going to read you just a little chunk here from section 546D, if I can find that real quick. He says, it's an interesting, this is too long of a section, isn't it? But basically what he says is that the aristocracy begins to give way to a timarchy when, it's weird, it has something to do with birth. He says, bearing and barrenness of soul and bodies come not only to plants in the earth, but to animals on earth, when revolutions complete for each, the bearing round of circles. So then he says, for some of these people will at some time beget children when they should not. Isn't this weird? And he starts talking about geometry. He says, of these elements, the root, 4, 3 mated with the 5, thrice increased, produces 2 harmonies. One of them is equal, and equal number of times taken 100 times over. This is one of those real obscure passages in Plato. Apparently the critics don't even know exactly what to make of it. But it certainly sounds like it has something to do with probably Pythagorean stuff. Maybe this is like what Malthus was into was that him, Malthus, in the 19th century? Talk about overpopulation or whatever. And he says here, when your guardians from ignorance of these geometries cause grooms to live with brides out of season, the children will have neither good natures nor good luck. Again, this is obscure, but I think it's kind of interesting, especially if you think of, I think, America and the West's general sort of difficulty lately in reproducing at, what do they call that, replacement level fertility, and the horrors that are, swiping left on Tinder or whatever. It just seems to be a kind of nightmare out there. Like where my wife's from New England, she always tells me none of her friends got married before age 30. Well, 30 is 14 years or so into peak fertility that has just been kind of, wasted on like, I don't know, dance clubs or something. And so it's probably somehow out of order. And I think that seems to be what Socrates is referring to here. And then what happens is, because of that, you're going to start to get like competition and what he calls faction. And in fact, let me see if I can find where he says, he says, those who previously were guarded by them as free friends and supporters, they then enslaved and held as serfs and domestics. Once faction had arisen, each of the two races, he's using these analogies, that's why it's hard to read to you guys, these two races, the iron and bronze, pulled the regime toward money-making and the possession of land, houses, gold, and silver, while the other two races, the gold and silver, not being poor but rich by nature, these would be like the true aristocrats, led the souls toward virtue and the ancient regime. So struggling and straining against one another, they came to an agreement on a middle way. And like, this is the idea of the arising of faction finally happens, okay? So one group wants essentially progress, and one wants to maintain the ancient regime. Listen to this little chunk from Federalist number 10, where I think it's Madison, I think it could be Hamilton, where Madison talks about the problem of faction, which of course he gets from Plato, or maybe Montesquieu, but certainly also Plato. And he says that the problem of faction is sown in the nature of man. Here's a clip. He says, okay, well, wait, before I read it, you know what faction is? I mean, faction is like a fracture. It's like when, what is, I can't remember exactly how he defines it, but basically like a group within the group or a state within the state that starts to emerge that wants its own laws, effectively. And so this is bad. This is going to break the state apart. So Madison says, quote, "The latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man. And we see them everywhere brought into different degrees of activity according to the different circumstances of civil society. A zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, and many other points, as well of speculation as of practice. An attachment to different leaders ambitiously contending for preeminence and power, or to persons of other descriptions whose fortunes have been interesting to the human passions, have in turn divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good." And then Madison says, "So strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities, that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts." I mean, here I think of like Irish and English fighting in a pub over a soccer game or something, or football, as they call it. And to me, this is a frivolous thing, but, people can get wound up over stuff like that because they like to fall into faction. And so Madison, I think, is right to identify that this is a part of human nature, is to sort of take sides. He also identifies the unequal distribution of property or money as the main cause of faction. So I don't know. Does this mean that, like the early American founders believed themselves to be founding a timocracy? Timocracy, by the way, usually is only landowners have a say in the government. So maybe they did, because I think that was true in the first generation or so of America. And given that they had earned their victory in war to gain sovereignty. And remember those stories about duels involving Aaron Burr, for instance, whose honor was insulted or whatever? Like, all of this suggests something kind of vaguely timocratic, I guess. Socrates describes the dissolution of timocracy as having something to do with, as I said, birth rate. And the whole thing is a weird... I basically would skip that section if you want and just trust that, like, timocracy is going to degenerate into an oligarchy because of this faction thing. Because then what you start to get are parties or groups of families or tribes or whatever. They're going to jockey for, good marriages and political power and so on. So that's basically the transformation. What we are is somewhere between an aristocracy where everyone is good and just, on its way to an oligarchy, which we will get to in just a minute, where essentially the rich or money rules the state. And here, in the oligarchy, people become obsessed with money, and the corresponding moral character, goes in the same direction, I suppose. He loves, where the timocratic man loved honor and victory. Let me actually slow down here. Let me suggest that the timocratic man was not the aristocratic man in this sense, okay? He loved honor and victory like the aristocratic man, but the timocratic man probably kind of hated, or maybe he avoided fighting himself, maybe he sent out some mercenaries to do it for him. He loves music, let's say, like the aristocratic man, but he isn't great at it himself. Okay, he loves hearing speeches, but he isn't particularly skilled in rhetoric himself, like the aristocratic man would be. So he's basically a poor imitator of the aristocratic man. Okay, he loves war, but not soldiering. Loves ruling, but not based on his virtues, right? Just based on raw power or something. So that's, okay, enough of the timocratic man. This all collapses into a base love of money and power. Socrates says, they progress in money-making, and the more honorable they consider it, the less honorable they consider virtue. Listen to this.
No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon.
You cannot.
Therefore I say to you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing?
Yes, right? Like that's Johnny Cash reading you the New Testament. I think that's around Matthew 6, like 24 or so. And I mean, the idea is, yeah, this is famous. You cannot serve both God and mammon, or, money. These oligarchic types honor the rich, though, and dishonor the poor. And that makes them corruptible, because if you honor money, you don't honor virtue quite as highly, and now you can be corrupted by payoffs or, honeypots or other like alluring offers. It makes them blind to the poor man among them, who is the excellent pilot. Remember last episode we talked about the pilot being basically born to do this, to lead. But if you don't have enough money in the oligarchic state, it doesn't matter if you have the skill to pilot. You were born in the wrong state and not near Washington, D.C., or, you didn't go to an Ivy League school, so forget about it, basically. The city, when this happens, the city becomes not one anymore, but two or more. The city of the poor and the city of the rich, now pitted against each other, right? Socrates says, dwelling together in the same place, ever plotting against each other. And he notes that beggars are a typical symptom of this regime becoming unstable. A society that will tolerate the homeless is divided already into rich and poor, where the rich take no responsibility for their poor comrades, and that indicates, this isn't a unified civilization anymore. Eventually, of course, and especially among the children of the oligarchs, who are spoiled by their rich fathers, a sort of degeneracy of virtue sets in. And eventually the poor simply won't put up with this corrupt rule. And since they have the numbers, they overthrow it. Thus, democracy is born. I'm trying to think whether I should do a digression here. I mean, for me, democracy, for many of us, right? For you, I imagine, democracy was taught to us as like the best government. And this is a good thing, and it's a virtuous thing. But what Socrates shows is that it's actually like a kind of degenerate version of oligarchy, where the peasants overthrow the oligarchs, and then like they all want to rule. And so what you've got is like basically a ship floating in the sea with no pilot on board. I mean, good luck, right? One interesting insight is that Socrates suggests it's, quote, not possible to honor wealth in a city and at the same time adequately to maintain moderation among the citizens, but one or the other is necessarily neglected. And I mean, I gotta wonder if Jesus read this or something, because that is exactly the same thing as that Johnny Cash clip a few minutes ago, right? You cannot serve both God and mammon. So like what happens is MTV starts to show its, Cribs show or Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, if you're, older than me, and encourages this kind of money worship. And, these people, these oligarchs, and the type who lives in an oligarchy, they love what is novel, and they love change. And so when, democracy presents itself as a possibility, they basically side with it, and eventually the tipping point comes. Socrates says, quote, democracy comes into being when the poor win, killing some of the others and casting out some, and share the regime and the ruling offices with those who are left on an equal basis. End quote. Sometimes this makes me think of the French Revolution, but sometimes, or the American Revolution, but sometimes it also makes me think of the Soviet Revolution. Just because something labels itself a democracy does not necessarily make it a philosophical democracy in the sense that Socrates means. Listen to this jingle I made today. Just playing around. Of democracy, Socrates says, quote, it is probably the fairest of the regimes. Just like a many-colored cloak decorated in all hues, this regime, decorated with all dispositions, would also look fairest. And many, perhaps, like boys and women looking at many-colored things, would judge this to be the fairest regime. End quote. And yes, the non-philosophers think democracy is best. And did you catch why? Have you understood why? The reason is they prefer appearances to realities. So it's the appearance of justness and virtue that they're after. And of course, anybody can appear virtuous, especially in if you've got wealth to sort of make yourself look like that. Okay, ready? So we're going to read a little bit here real quick. 558a. Of democracy, Socrates, essentially he says, look, they're going to have all kinds of freedom now. And he says, isn't such a way of passing the time divinely sweet for the moment? And Glaucon says, perhaps for the moment. Socrates says, and what about this? Isn't the gentleness towards some of the condemned exquisite? Or in such a regime, haven't you yet seen men who have been sentenced to death or exile nonetheless staying and carrying on right in the middle of things? And as though no one cared or saw, stalking the land like a hero? Yes, Glaucon says. And this regime's sympathy and total lack of pettiness or despising what we were saying so solemnly when we were founding the city, that unless a man has a transcendent nature, he would never become good, if from earliest childhood his play isn't noble and all his practices aren't such. How magnificently it tramples all this underfoot, and doesn't care at all from what kinds of practices a man goes to political action, but honors him if only he says he's well disposed toward the multitude. So that's a democracy. I mean, what a mess that's going to be, right? Okay, so let's see, food. I'm getting to the next part here. So then I'm trying to skip some of these. Really, there's he compares it to drones in a honey or in a bee colony, and it's a hard metaphor, but it kind of works. And then he talks about education and anarchy and freedom and wastefulness and all that stuff. He says, quote, if this democratic man, if he has good luck and his frenzy does not go beyond bounds, and if also, as a result of getting somewhat older and the great disturbances having passed by, he readmits a part of the exiles and doesn't give himself wholly over to the invaders, then he lives his life in accord with a certain equality of pleasures he has established. To whichever one happens along, as though it were chosen by the lot, he hands over the rule within himself until it is satisfied. And then again to another, dishonoring none but fostering them all on the basis of equality. So in other words, this guy's ready to let anybody rule at this point. He's so laid back. Continuing, he doesn't admit true speech or let it pass into the guardhouse. If someone says that there are some pleasures belonging to fine and good desires and some belonging to bad desires, and that the ones must be practiced and honored and the others checked and enslaved, rather, he shakes his head at all this and says that all are alike and must be honored on an equal basis. So this is the man who, he makes no distinction. There's no such thing as sexual morality or vice or any of that. It's all just whatever you want to do. That's all there is in the city anymore, as far as he can see. Okay, the description that follows here is so incredible. I have this burned into my mind. In fact, somewhere I published an article on this section once with a political philosophy professor that I won't name, I guess, but we did the sections 562b through 566b. And I'm not going to lie, this really seems to me to be a description of our own regime. It's possible that that's only my interpretation, but I know that it will resonate with anyone on the kind of authentic political right, and especially anyone who venerates any tradition in any way. But it won't necessarily do the trick for Republicans who talk about freedom and prosperity without realizing, I don't think they do, that these are precisely the dynamics that make the dissolution of democracy inevitable and the coming of tyranny. So skim through it with me here. This is 562b. And it starts with Socrates saying, okay, the oligarchy was overthrown because they got carried away with wealth. And then he says, and does the greediness for what democracy defines as good also dissolve it? And so Glaucon says, well, what do you say defines that? And he says freedom. Okay, freedom. is what defines democracy. For surely in a city under a democracy, you would hear that this is the finest thing it has, and that for this reason it is the only regime worth living in for anyone who is by nature free. Yes, indeed, he said, that's an often repeated phrase. And Socrates says, then, as I was going to say just now, does the insatiable desire of this and the neglect of the rest change this regime and prepare a need for tyranny? Glaucon asks, how? I suppose that when a democratic city, once it's thirsted for freedom, gets bad wine bearers as its leaders and gets more drunk than it should on this unmixed draft, freedom, then, unless the rulers are very gentle and provide a great deal of freedom, it punishes them, charging them with being polluted and oligarchs. Yes, that's what they do. And it spatters with mud those who are obedient, alleging that they are willing slaves of the rulers and nothings, while it praises and honors, both in private and in public, the rulers who are like the ruled, and the ruled who are like the rulers. Isn't it necessary in such a city that freedom spread to everything? And, my friend, for it to filter down to the private houses and end up by anarchies being planted in the very beasts or animals. Glaucon says, how do we mean by that? And Socrates says, that a father habituates himself to be like his child and fear his sons. And a son habituates himself to be like his father and to have no shame before or fear his parents. That's so he may be free. And metic is on an equal level with townsmen, and townsmen with metic. This is the, I think the metic is like the servant. And similarly with the foreigner, he says. So do you see what's happening here? Like in a democracy, everything wants to be equal. The immigrant has to be equal to the citizen. The child has to be equal to the father. Yes, Glaucon says, that's what happens. These and other small things of the following kind come to pass. As the teacher in such a situation is frightened of the pupils and fawns on them, so the students make light of their teachers, as well as of their attendants. And generally, the young copy their elders and compete with them in speeches and deeds, while the old come down to the level of the young, imitating the young. They are overflowing with facility and charm. And that's so that they won't seem to be unpleasant or despotic. Got to admit, I've done this. I've done this when I was a teacher. It's like, hey, I'm the cool teacher here. I'm not going to be hard about grading or turning things in on time. You don't have to fear me, And it's a way of conflict avoiding or something. But that is the democratic mindset. And continuing, and the ultimate in the freedom of the multitude, my friend, occurs in such a city when the purchased slaves, male and female, are no less free than those who have bought them. And we almost forgot to mention the extent of the law of equality and of freedom in the relations of women with men and men with women. And skipping a bit, he says, he's talking about the animals. I love this part because I think I made a joke about untrained dogs or whatever in the last episode. And he says the same thing is happening here. He says, have you ever noticed the extent to which beasts subject to human beings are freer here than in another city? The bitches follow the proverb exactly and become like their mistresses. And of course, there come to be horses and asses who have gotten the habit of making their way quite freely and solemnly, bumping into whomever they happen to meet on the roads if he doesn't stand aside, and all else is similarly full of freedom. And here I picture like India, where cows are just wandering around, bumping into people and stuff. Then summing up all these things together, Socrates says, do you notice how tender they make the citizen's soul, so that if someone proposes anything that smacks in any way of subjection, they are irritated and can't stand it. And they end up, as you well know, by paying no attention to the laws, written or unwritten, in order that they may avoid having any master at all. And Glaucon says, of course, I know it. And Socrates says, well then, my friend, this is the beginning, so fair and heady, from which tyranny, in my opinion, naturally grows. Too much freedom seems to change into nothing but too much slavery. And so this is sort of the direction that Socrates goes. I mean, I think it's such an amazing couple of pages here. I won't read you the whole thing, but you should go all the way through 566b. He talks about like an increase in litigiousness and how people just chafe at the slightest touch of authority. At one point he says, to the extent that the leaders, in taking away the substance of those who have it and distributing it among the people, are able to keep the greatest part of it for themselves, that is the money or the property, then I suppose that those men whose property is taken away are compelled to defend themselves by speaking before the people and by doing whatever they can. For this they are charged by others, even if they don't desire to make innovations, with plotting against the people and being oligarchs. And so basically you've got like Occupy Wall Street, Antifa types showing up now, charging anyone who wants, their property rights as being some kind of a reactionary or anti-disestablishmentarianist, right? Okay, so when everything gets bad enough under democracy and people won't tolerate any authority, that's when tyranny arises. It's automatic, like clockwork. Nothing you can do to stop it. I just wanted to end briefly by returning us to the idea that all of this is just an analogy for individual psychology. And so what would it mean for, the runaway demand for freedom to turn into a tyranny in an individual? And here I think of things like self-discipline, right? Like, if you can't get the logos within you, the reason within you, the highest part of yourself, to set some rules for the guardian within you, which would be sort of the middle, remember Freud's thing about the superego, the ego, and the id? So like the superego sort of sets some boundaries for the ego there. And then you've got the id always barking to break the rules, basically. And so if you start to let yourself have total freedom, the idea would be that eventually you will become enslaved to one thing or another, right? Some sort of habit or addictive substance or vice or whatever. And so you need to put the philosopher king within yourself in charge of stuff. Let me play my new jingle again and see how it sounds here. And then I might have one sort of notes about where we're going next. Okay, so we're done with Plato, at least for now. I certainly could return someday and talk about, the Symposium or the Apology, or, even if somebody starts arguing with me, I wouldn't even, mind talking about, Gorgias or Protagoras. I love the Parmenides dialogue, but I just can't imagine doing an episode on it. For my mind, this is the big sacred one for Plato. If you just read the Republic a couple of times, I think you'll probably start to get it. As I said, when I was younger, I got it. When I was in my 20s, I liked the Republic, but I didn't understand the whole thing where the middle 6 books are just an analogy, basically. And so to me, it changes the whole thing to an almost mystical text when you understand that we're really still talking about human psychology and virtue and the good all the way through all this stuff. Let me pull up my notes here about where we're headed for the future. I don't have any requests that I remember, so I think what we'll do is just kind of roughly continue on with the list that I initially posted, which would get us to Venerable Bede next, the early English historian, and the theme for that one is the enchanted worldview. It'll be a fun thing to talk about next, because I think really, in some sense, it's the kind of, although I think it was written in the 8th century, early 8th century in England, but it's got this brand new kind of mythic feel to it. And Bede, he talks all the time about people doing miracles and being healed, and if not rising from the dead, very nearly that sort of a thing. It's the kind of text that, I don't know, someone can tell me if they still sometimes teach, I'm guessing little excerpts or something from it in England, but they don't teach it ever in America, unless you're like a medieval studies major or go to get your master's degree. You won't read any Bede, which is too bad, because what it does is it sort of recounts the ecclesiastical or the church history of England. And it gives you a sense that at least in the 8th century, there was there were wonders happening, and that like life felt different for these people in the 8th century. So probably what I'll do is just read you some of the more fun excerpts from Bede and challenge you to think about, like, because it is risky, but like, could we put on enchanted goggles and essentially go looking for miracles in the world? I mean, do these things, like, what are we to make of this report? Is this just an insane man? It doesn't seem like it. He wrote very sane sounding sermons. His prose is elevated at levels most of you couldn't emulate. And so it's unlikely that he's like a schizophrenic. Instead, I think what's happening is he's sort of, he's processing the raw data of the senses a little differently than most of you who grew up like watching baseball and TV and eating, microwavable dinners process the world. There's something more happening for him when he looks at, especially interactions between, people, between Christians and non-Christians, and Christians and fellow Christians, and so on. So we'll do that next time. I don't expect you to read all 450 pages of it before next time, because I'm a democratic teacher, aren't I? No hard breaks here, guys. Like, just do whatever you want. I'm down on your level. You don't have to. You don't have to do anything, but just sort of listen. What a democratic civilization. And yeah, I mean, I get. Like, it is kind of interesting, isn't it? Nobody ever tells you, do they? Did any of you learn that the great Socrates, everyone's heard of Socrates, he says that every democracy collapses into tyranny. Like, automatic. It's like clockwork. It's a mechanism. But we were taught that democracy is so good, and it's almost the end of history and stuff. It turns out, no, this is all on a big timer, one big cycle, and apparently we're crashing real fast, it seems, into tyranny. I heard, I guess before I go, I could recommend, if you go to your podcast app after this and look up Radiolab, which you used to listen to before it became so totally NPR-ified that it was just silly. But about 2 episodes ago, maybe 3, there's an episode, I forget the title of it, but it was about like sort of a war games version of the election that's coming up. And they gamed it out, to see what might happen. And apparently widespread civil unrest is on the horizon, or is very likely to be. And so like the collapse into tyranny, I don't know, you guys, I hope it's not happening, but if it happens, like, at least you'll all have the solace that like Socrates was right all along. All right, here's the outro music. Talk to you next time on the Godward Podcast.